a way forward after COP26, the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, and the Generation Equality Forum. This is Sunita Nasser, a UN official and a civil engineer dedicated to promoting sustainable development and the empowerment of women. Today, I am moderating this side event of Feminist Climate Justice, hosted by Global Women Leader Voices for Change and Inclusion. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Global Women Leader Voices, which is a strong voice of advocacy group to work on multilateralism and gender. Before starting our session, I invite you all to please watch a short video about Global Women Leader Voices, achievement of women leaders in last 3 years, because it's the 3rd anniversary of Global Women Leader Voices. Thank you. Can we have the video, please? Ms. Julie, can we have the video? I think we are having some problem. Maybe we can show the video later. So I will start with the introduction of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining this event. I will start introducing our panelists, as we have our panelists here. Ms. Cristina Figueres. She was appointed Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in July 2010. During the next 6 years, she worked to rebuild the global climate change negotiation process leading to the 2050 Paris Agreement. Ms. Figueres has worked in the field of climate change, sustainable development, energy, land use, and technical and financial cooperation. She is a founder of the Global Optimism Group and the author of the Future We Choose. Surviving the climate crisis, Ms. Figueres also served as Minister Counselor at the Embassy of Costa Rica in Bonn, Germany. Our second panelist, Ms. Marie Robinson. Her Excellency served as the 7th President of Ireland. She also served as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Ms. Robinson formed Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative in July 2014. Ban Ki-moon made her his special representative for climate change and interact with global leaders ahead of the 2040 Climate Summit. In March 2030, Ms. Robinson was chosen to oversee the implementation of a peace deal to stabilize the troubled Central Africa country on Congo. And after that, she was appointed as the chair of the Elders, an organization with which she had been collaborating for years. Our youngest panelist, Nasreen Elsam. Ms. Nasreen Elsam is an environmental and climate activist. She pursued her master's degree in renewable energy. She is general coordinator for the Youth and Environment Sudan platform to give all environment working youth the networking they need. Also, Ms. Nasreen is the chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, and also she is a junior negotiator with the African Group of Negotiators in technology transfer, focusing on the policies of countries regarding climate change and renewable energies. She has wrote several policy papers in climate change, renewable energy, gender, and youth empowerment. She is currently the chair of the UN Secretary General Youth Advisor on climate change, along with her other 6 young partners. And our 4th panelist is Ms. Jenny Yazzie. And Ms. Jenny Yazzie is an entrepreneur, community mobilizer, and human rights advocate for the Navajo Nation. She has worked with the nations building with indigenous community, co-founder of 6 World Solution LLP, and co-founder of the Navajo Nation. And later, Colorado River Watershed Chapters Association, Restoration and Protection of Traditional Ecological Knowledge. Ms. Jenny is a community organizer and human rights advocate that has worked on creating rights-based approach to development with the indigenous community across the United States and internationally. I welcome you all to the Feminist Climate Justice, a way forward of the Conference of Parties 26 and the Generation of Equality Forum. Considering this year's Commission on the Status of Women, theme on gender equality and in the empowerment of women and girls in the context of climate change, Global Women Leader Voices for Change and Inclusion wants to assess the outcome of COP26 as they relate to the gender and climate nexus. Today, through this event, we will bring together the commitment made in Generation Equality Forum Action Coalition on Feminist Climate Justice and the need to prepare for COP27 in Egypt. As it's time for action, it's time for deeds, not words. We want to bring an intergenerational and intercultural dialogue around the main themes and also to assess the outcome of COP26, as they are related to the gender and climate nexus. I just received a notice that Ms. Christina Figueres, she has to leave earlier. If you agree with me, I will start with Ms. Figueres, our questions. Then she can leave, and after that, I will continue with our other panelists. Welcome, Ms. Christina Figueres. Once again, we are glad to have you here. Ms. Figueres, we want to know what are the needs to happen from Glasgow to Egypt for COP27 to be a success as we implement in the Paris Agreement and beyond? What can women in leadership like you do contribute to a successful outcome? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sunita, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. I see several very good friends on the screen. Mary, Nazreen, how are you? Really wonderful to be brought together by GWL Voices. So nice, and thank you for hosting us, Sunita. I do apologize to everyone. I have been inexplicably double booked this morning, and so I have to jump off to another live event immediately. But I just wanted to still be with you first to pay tribute and honor all the wonderful women on the screen, as well as listening and participating here. But also just to make a call to action. And that is, and if you allow me, Sunita, to digress for a moment from COP26 and COP27, because it seems to me that we are living right now in an ultra emergency for climate action and certainly for climate justice. We are in a war in the Ukraine, and what that has actually meant is that there are many voices that are now coming out arguing that that would mean that we need to double down on our investments into oil and gas, in fact, even coal. Countries using this as what I would call a feeble excuse to dig up more coal, to drill for more oil and gas, arguing that we cannot continue to depend on Russia and other countries for energy. I would agree with the argument that we cannot continue to depend on completely irresponsible and unpredictable regimes for our energy sources. But that does not mean that we then go back to the 20th century and continue to dig up the sources of energy that we know are causing such devastating effect, especially on women and children around the world. So it seems to me that right now, without waiting for COP27, right now, the responsibility of female voices is to lift our voices and make the argument very clearly that yes, we need more energy independence for every country, but that energy independence has to be based on our domestically produced renewable energies that give us more independence because they are domestically produced, but they are clean and stable and predictable across generations. And above all, they allow future generations to have a future. We cannot wait to COP27 to begin to put that message out. It is a very urgent message. We have to start right now. And why can women make that argument better, I think, than most others, better than men? Because we have to buttress that argument with the human story. Why are we doing this? Because we are protecting women and children of future generations. And women have to make that argument. And the other reason why we have to raise our voices is because as women, we tend to have the long-term view in mind. We tend to think long-term and be able to think about both short and long-term. Apparently, there's some people who can only think about the short-term. Where are we going to get gas next week? That is important, but it's also important, where are we going to get our energy over the next 8 years, which is the decisive decade, not only on climate. I would argue it is the decisive decade, certainly for climate justice, certainly for many issues under human rights. This is the decisive decade of humanity. And we have to take the decade as our point of reference and be vehement about the response that we're having to the Russian invasion on Ukraine with respect to energy sources. Over to you, Sunita.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much, Ms. Figoris. Before you leave the event, I will like to ask one more question. As a former secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, member of Global Women Leader Voices, you were instrumental in the crafting and adoption of the landmark Climate Paris Agreement. What needs to happen for the world to deliver and fulfill with the Paris Agreement goals? What can you as a woman leader do to make the difference?
Well, as I just mentioned, we have to cut emissions in half by 2030. There is no doubt about that. That is the only way to protect the future of vulnerable people. In fact, to protect the present of vulnerable people, especially women and children, we have to cut our emissions in half. That is dictated by science. We don't have to argue about that. And that would be the timely implementation of the Paris Agreement. And as I said, there are the voices of women are the voices of the highest credibility. We are the ones that can deliver this message because we deliver it from the bottom of our gut. This is not just because we think it. This is because we know it to be true. We know that this is the case. It is not just a mental mind message. This comes way deep down from our role as women of stewards of future generations and of the home planet on which we live.
Thank you so very much. Thanks much. Well, I will, in today's session, we are emphasizing on gender-sensitive climate finance and the need for disaggregated data on the gender-environment connection to inform climate policy plans and strategies. So I will ask again my first question that I have asked from Ms. Figoris, from our other panelists. What needs to happen from Glasgow to Egypt for COP27 to be a success as we implement the Paris Agreement and beyond? What can women in leadership like you do to contribute to a successful outcomes? So this is my main question. Any of the panelists who are willing to answer first will be welcome. Thank you. Ms. Robinson, please go ahead.
First of all, I'm delighted also to be on this panel, and I love the title of it. GWL, which I'm part of, Voices on Feminist Climate Justice, a way forward after COP26 and the Generation Equality Forum. I'm very pleased that we have young people like Nisreen. We met each other in COP26, of course. I'm looking forward to Janine. I don't think we've met before. And of course, Christiana and myself are sisters. There are actually many strands to feminism. And I think one of the things we want to do is encourage more and more women, and then more and more men as well, to be comfortable in the skin of calling themselves feminists. Because that means that you want the kind of change that will change our world very radically. Our world is not in a good place at the moment for so many reasons. Christiana referenced Ukraine at the start. It's hard not to do that. But actually, our financial system isn't working properly. Our inequality is inexcusable. So we need a feminist, leadership. What is that? It is problem solving, participatory, listening, caring about those you serve, caring deeply about the people that you want to influence and work for. All of those are part of a feminist approach. So as I say, first of all, let's build on the fact that we're now talking about a feminist approach, feminist climate justice and a feminist approach way forward after COP26. What was the problem in COP26? I called it male, pale and stale, and it caught on quite a bit. It was, far too few women actually in leadership, even though the United Kingdom under Alex Sharma, who did his best, I must say, tried to say it would be the most diverse, the most inclusive. It wasn't. That's the first point. And that matters. Let me give you an example of how I saw, tangibly how that mattered in COP26. I was at a dinner and it was pointed out to me that there were women who'd come from all over the Amazon, indigenous women, and I hope Janine will speak to this. And they were so angry and so frustrated. They didn't have delegate badges. They were out in a vibrant part of Glasgow, but not where they could actually speak to anybody who was making decisions. And so we decided, a number of us, to stand with these women. But more important, there was one of them, Helena, and I can't for the moment remember her second name, from Ecuador, who had taught herself English so that she could speak for the Amazon women. And I happened to be doing a Sky broadcast, and I allowed her to take my slot, if you like, with Sky's agreement. And actually, she was so good. Her story was so powerful. She told it so well. She got twice as much time on Sky. I saw them extend her twice, and I was delighted, because this was the voices people should be hearing, but they weren't. And then we listened to the anguish of the Amazon women, which was a twofold anguish, that they themselves were being marginalized and poorer because of the mining and everything else that was going on. And secondly, the Amazon itself was in danger, and they knew it, and they were frontline, experts on it. Now we know from a recent report, the Amazon is in great danger. They were warning about that at COP26. We didn't pay enough attention. So that's one of the things. Women have to be at the table. Young women, indigenous women, grassroots women, women who know frontline what the issues are. And then we need to increase the financing for gender just climate solutions. That was one of the points that was made in the Feminist Action for Climate Justice, which the elders were very supportive of. Secondly, we need women and girls to lead a transition to a green economy. And that's where I totally agree with the point that Christiana made so forcefully. I understand a frustration, Christiana, when you're double booked. It does happen. And I know you want to be on this panel and would like to stay here, but you made the point very well that we need energy security. Everybody's talking about it, but it's not the energy security of more oil and gas and even coal, which is, what's tending to be talked about too much in Europe and too much in the United States, etc., in trying to address the Ukrainian crisis, if I can call it that. It is domestically produced clean energy, and it is support for domestically produced clean energy that we need to be emphasizing as women leaders. And we also need to build the resilience of women and girls to climate impacts and disaster risks. It's happening. Women are making themselves more and more resilient, but they're not getting the support. Look at the finance that goes to women-led groups. I think Oxfam had a report, and I think it was something like 1.5% of funding went, only about 0.2% actually got to women's groups on the ground, very tiny. The only people who really support are those who take the time to do it well, like the Global Green Grants Fund, who have very good allies locally who say, fund this group, fund that group, fund these, they're doing great work. Don't expect them to spend all their time reporting to you. That's not what it's about. They're doing good work, fund them. And I think we need more, we need far more both philanthropies and other organizations who trust women to know what is best for them. So I'll stop at this point because I want to hear my fellow panelists. Oh, and by the way, sorry, Sunita, I've just been reading about you, and it's wonderful to have an Afghan woman leading us as moderator. And I know you're in Spain at the moment, and I hope that you get back to your country quite soon and can fulfill whatever potential you have. You're a civil engineer, I read, and it's great to have you moderating us, and you're doing it superbly so far. Well done.
Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry, Sunita. I'm so sorry, Janine. I'm so sorry, Nazreen and Mary, that I will have to let you go, or me go. I will catch up via Mary, if I may. And all my best to you. Thank you for being such brave women.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us in this session. Thank you so much, Ms. Marie. We all know about the tragedy happened in Afghanistan. So after the collapse of the country, I had to leave to save my life. So it has been 7 months that I have been evacuated from Afghanistan by the government of Spain. So now I'm in Spain. I'm living here with my husband and with my daughter.
How old is your daughter?
She is 1.5 years old.
1.5 years. I want her to grow up going back to school in Afghanistan. Okay.
Okay. This is the dream of every person who experienced a life of refugee. So they are just willing to live for their country on the moment.
Yeah.
Let's hear from Miss Jenny Yazi regarding the impact. Over to you, Miss Jenny.
Absolutely, and thank you. And thank you to my distinguished panelists. It's such an honor to share space with you all, albeit virtual. Maybe in the future, one day we can all be in person to have this very important discussion that deserves much more time to really talk about the complexities that we're facing when it comes to gender equity at the international level. Like Christina said, I share her sense of urgency, but I may be a little different because in being an Indigenous woman, we've been living with a sense of urgency for quite some time. Black, brown, and Indigenous peoples have been on the front line of these issues of both climate change impacts, of also the impacts of unsustainable development, and of the constant drive to monopolize wealth and resources all around the globe that have really put humanity in this position. And so being an Indigenous woman, I've recognized that we have always been at war. And we have always needed urgent action in order to reverse the course of our pathway forward for the sake of our humanity and the sake of our future generations. And I think that what's going on now is really just emphasizing to us how much more urgent it is. We've been talking about gender equity needing to be in spaces like COP for a long time. And in fact, in COP25, the Indigenous woman created an Indigenous Woman Declaration to try to address some of the issues of access to the negotiation spaces. But when the world was grappling with the pandemic, one of the things that has not been adequately addressed is the increase in violence that meant for women and children around the globe. due to the prolonged isolation, the cutoff from many social nets and resources that were necessary. So it doesn't surprise me what we've seen at the last COP and not really achieving much by terms of gender equity. But it's so important to emphasize to those who do hold power in these spaces that in order for these spaces to be legitimate and meaningful and effective at what we're tasked to do, it needs to reflect the type of gender equity that we seek to create in this world. And until we do that, we will continue to fall short from not only our climate goals, but our goals and our need to protect such safeguards like human rights and indigenous rights, because we cannot properly advocate for the changes and the solutions that need to be made if our frontline voices do not have access to these spaces to negotiate on behalf of their families and their communities on their own. It's not just COP. It's, we know there are a series of meetings leading up to COP in which many things are already pre-negotiated and decided by the time it gets to the Conference of the Parties. And so we need this equity throughout all of those mechanisms and processes. And we must be uncompromising in this. I also wanted to point out something that Mary shared about how, there are different streams of feminism, because this is very important to me as an Indigenous feminist. For a long time, women of color have been left out of mainstream Western feminist movements. Our issues, our unique challenges, the unique solutions and situations that our communities face have been left out of these conversations. And so we also need a feminism that represents the diversity of our world, the diversity of our peoples, and one that is rooted in understanding a feminist economy, feminist foreign policy, and anti-nuclearism, because all of these things come to a head when we talk about what meaningful and successful climate solutions need to be, because it's wrapped up in all of these pathways of governance, of international negotiations, and then of the situation that we're dealing with all around the globe right now. Women like me often face many barriers to participation. So in our work that we're doing on the ground, we have so much to do to create awareness and education around what these spaces actually mean and the real impact they have on our communities, and let alone also having to navigate the barriers to actually access these spaces. And so I hope that we can make commitments, firm commitments, to continue to advocate and push for increasing pathways to access, and also ensuring that it's not just participation, it is actual roles and decision-making processes for all of our women who are carrying the voices of their communities and of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Jenny. Over to you, Ms. Nasreen.
Hi, everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you all today, and of course glad to see Christina and Mary Robinson and Jenny also. I have some reflections on the previous interactions before I go to my own interaction. First of all, Jenny, when we meet next time physically, we will be actually doing what we discussed today. We will not discuss it again because we really don't have time. And to reflect on what Christina mentioned earlier and Mary also mentioned, I think what happens in Ukraine, not only in Ukraine, but around the world, is very much connected. And I can tell because I come from a country that suffered from civil wars for almost more than 40 years. I can see that, first of all, the huge impact of falling of democracies around the world is fueling wars. And why I am saying this, because I know also how difficult it is to talk about climate change, about environmental governance, about clean energy, about internal clean development mechanisms in the shade of dictatorship, for example, in the shade of a very bad governance structure, in the shade of corruption, and in the shade of what's happening around the world and happening in my country, and especially in Africa, every day. I have a friend and a colleague, his name is Vlad. He's from Moldova, which is one of the countries that's hosting very big number of Ukrainian refugees. And he called me panicking. Nisreen, they are starting to cut the trees from the Ukrainian forest for security reason. And I didn't react as he expected me to react. And he said, what's wrong? I said, well, what's new? Unfortunately, this procedure have been done in many countries for many years. All of the military operations thinks that they should cut the tree because the tree makes, you can't see for a long distance, you can't see what's in front of you, and you can't judge well when you can't see. So the simple answer for that is deforestation. And then, of course, a lot of soldiers after the war, they decarbonize this wood and this forest that they cut, and they sell it as charcoal, especially in the African continent, because we already have a problem accessing energy. So biomass and charcoal are huge sources of energy. As we are speaking right now, we have 2 airports in Sudan totally emptied only for Russian airplanes to come and take as much gold from Sudan as they want. I can tell you until tomorrow how bad condition it is. We can talk about the mercury use, we can talk about cyanide use, we can talk about very unhealthy condition for mining for this gold. Bad guys are teaming up, and the world is still looking away until the problem actually touched them. I thought that we learned the lesson by the pandemic. I mean, it was very obvious for all of us that when a pandemic happened, it will destroy every infrastructure. It doesn't matter if you are in Europe, in US, in Africa, in South Asia, wherever. If you have a pandemic, then you have a pandemic. It's the same with the war. Everything is very much interlinked, and unfortunately, it's the same with climate change. I will ask you a big question. When was the last time you heard about climate crisis during this Ukrainian problem? We tend to very much get distracted by the instant problems that we have in the world, and we forgot about the problems that's happening parallelly all of the time in the background. And climate change is one of them. It's not fair for anyone to lose their home. I'm sorry for you, our moderator, but it's happening everywhere, and it's not the first time that we had a crisis like the Ukrainian. It's just showing us that we are going backward, not forward. And now I think the huge panic and the huge media campaign is just because Ukraine is in the European continent. It's very sad for me to say it, but really humanity is suffering right now from the lack of solidarity, showing how different it is, the value of humanity itself. I'm sorry this is not the topic of today, but it was very important for someone who suffered from war for a long time, and we didn't have even quarter of attention. And now I'm fighting for climate change, and I also see that climate change is not getting also half of or quarter of the attention. Other than that, also countries decided to invest in armies instead of invest in renewable energies. And we have a big country like Germany, for example, who decided to invest more in their army instead of investing more in the renewable energy. I can tell you that now the average amount of money that Russia is receiving only from Europe for LNG, gas and oil is only enough to fuel 10 other wars, not only the war in Ukraine. So as you all mentioned, having sustainable energy and very much clear link between how can fossil fuel finance wars is very important to mention now and in every time. Females, young girls, women are almost the victims, but also they are always the survivors. Investing in young women, young girls is the solution for the future. And I'm saying this because Mary mentioned earlier, it's not 1.5, it's actually 2% of the finance goes to climate change. 0.2 really goes to women-led organization, but 0.1, which is half of the amount, goes to youth-led organization, which means that actually the most dynamic part of the humanity, the most dynamic part of the population are being neglected and systematically neglected, because the current system we are talking about is requiring a specific guidelines for proposals, specific guidelines for monitoring and evaluation, and specific guidelines also for how to report back on it. I don't know how to write, but I know how to serve my community, for example. I don't have the right to access any kind of finance. Okay, then invest in education so we can actually have a right education to write the right proposals so we can get funded. If we discussed how empty loop and circle we are actually running in right now, we would be get frustrated. But the hope that the new generation knows exactly what we want. We knows how to reach it. We just need the help, the experience, and the finance from the older generation so we can actually move forward and not repeat the same mistakes of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Nasreen Esami, for your insight. As pain of all of our, we all have the same pain. We all have suffered. It doesn't matter to which part of the world we belong. So these pandemics affected all of us. And moving forward, as we are witnessing, COVID-19 pandemic is not just a health issue, it's a profound shock to our society and economy. And women are the heart of the care and response for this pandemic. I would want to know how can we ensure that effort to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic factor in a low carbon, high quality, cross-cutting approach. From our panelists, it's over to you. Any of you want to answer it first? Thank you so much.
Since I started, I will continue.
Yeah, continue.
Please, Ms. Marie Robinson, please go ahead.
No, Nishan, continue.
Thank you very much, Mary. I just want to say that COVID-19 was a huge experience and huge test for all the humanity, as I mentioned earlier. But I think the actual pandemic is not in the virus that got into us. The actual pandemic is how the world is currently built on and how the world is currently being run. I don't think the COVID-19 will be the last pandemic this century, or at least this decade, actually, let me say decade, witness. My only fear that we will have different kind of pandemics, not only health-wise, but also economy and also humanity-wise. And I think what's happening in Ukraine right now and many other evidence are exactly telling or correcting my doubts. We are not afraid from that future. We just feel that we can prevent it if we all work together. Governments, civil society, young people, indigenous communities, world leaders. Because prevention, we always say prevention is better than cure, but we never costed how much prevention will cost us right now, comparing to what cure will cost us at the end. Some issues doesn't have cure. If there's a flood and it destroyed the whole country, there is no cure for that. If we wake up one day and we discovered that there is no more Maldives, for example, because it's very small and very low and it's being swallowed by the rise of the sea level, there is no cure for that. We saw what happened in Samoa, the big volcanic. I don't think there's a cure for that. So unfortunately, now we are talking about a zero-sum equation. And sorry, I'm a physicist, that's why equation is my game. Zero-sum equation means there is no win-win situation. It's either us who are advocating for the right things, protecting women, educating girls, advocating for climate justice and environmental justice, stopping war, shifting to green renewable energy, domestic green renewable energy. It's either we win or we will all lose, whether they realized it or not. I know all of us here as colleagues, we realize it very much. So I'm not really worried about the COVID pandemic because we lost very dear people to us, but it's almost past now. I'm very worried about what will happen in the future if we continue with the same behaviors and if we continued having the same leadership. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll come in now after Nisreen. And the first thing I want to do is actually ask you, Nisreen, I remember our discussions in COP26. You were very brave at the time. You were very worried about what was happening in your country. And now you're back in your country. I want to know, how are you? Are you okay? Are you okay?
I am also in Paris. I'm not in my country.
Oh, you're in Paris. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, people are being killed every day. It's not easy to live there
Yeah.
with the whole of the economic situation. But
Yeah.
yeah, we're surviving.
Well, I know your spirit because I saw that and I've heard it again today. So I want to pick up on the point you're making. This is, you know, a really acute time. It's the most acute time in my long life. I'm old, I'm an elder, and I have not seen in my own continent. I have seen it very much as High Commissioner for Human Rights, and since then, particularly a special envoy for the Great Lakes in Africa. I've seen wars elsewhere. And you're right, Nasreen, there is a double standard, unfortunately. And we're now very focused on Ukraine because it's Europe and it gets a huge amount of attention. And we need to have at least an equal focus on how we deal with the crisis that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us about on the last day of February. If it wasn't for Ukraine, we would pay far, far more attention to that report because it's telling us, it was about adaptation, and it was telling us literally that the world is in crisis in the shocks that it is enduring. And actually the word adaptation is totally inappropriate. You know, you can't adapt to what's destroying you. It's the wrong word, but it's the word we use in climate terms. But we certainly need far more attention to that. In COP26, there was a commitment to double adaptation climate finance by 2025. And my understanding is that there's still no real roadmap or plan for that. It's words. So, you know, we are up against a huge need to concert together, particularly the women's movement at every level, in order to press for the priorities that are going to really matter. I listened very carefully to what Nadine was saying as well, or Janine, sorry, was saying, that, you know, we need far more gender equity, and we're not getting that. We don't have the voices now. Egypt has a woman minister for environment and has other women involved, and I gather is wanting to be inclusive, but that was in the way that the UK said the same thing. So let's make sure, because it does matter who's at the table. It does matter who's going to be deciding. It does matter, you know, and I think we really need to understand. I agree with you that there are very negative forces pulling in the wrong direction. So to your question, because I've strayed a little bit away from your question, Sunita, about coming out of COVID. Unfortunately, even before the Ukraine crisis, too many countries were trying to zoom ahead with growth, as if we were back in where we shouldn't want to return to. We were in and are in an unsustainable world, to try to get back to a so-called economic growth for its own sake, which is indiscriminate in just trying to power up the economy, is not the right way. We actually need to be much, much more thoughtful about how we move forward, how we, you know, live truly sustainably with our world. You know, Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, spoke about intrinsic ecology. That is something that indigenous peoples fully understand. The fact that we are linked totally with each other. I think the women's movement needs to talk far more about these issues, about the fact that we are destroying the ecosystems that sustain us. It's not just climate, it's the biodiversity, it's the extinction of species, it's what we're doing to the oceans, it's what we're doing to the Amazon, and we need to have a women's movement that has a sense of our relationship with the rest of the whole species. All of the and the mountains and the rivers in much more of an indigenous way. I was very fortunate when I became UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that I was the coordinator of the Decade of Indigenous Peoples for the UN. I had no idea what that meant. I remember asking, how many indigenous people are there, and being told at least 400 million, probably more. And of course, it would be much more now. But I learned to listen. And the more I have listened, the more I have learned, quite frankly. And I'm still in a learning curve. I now commune with nature in a way that I didn't. I now feel the pain of nature in a way that I didn't. And we all have to do that now. We have to somehow, understand that we need to, move to a different kind of sustainable that isn't talking about the kind of economic growth of coming out of COVID in those terms, but does talk about, basic standards, human rights standards of food, water, health, education, shelter, freedoms that the human rights formula brings. And I'm interested in the scientific work on planetary boundaries that Johan Rockström and others are involved in. And I'm interested in the economics of that, the donut economics. I don't know whether you've been reading Kate, whatever her name is, who's written based on the planetary boundaries. She's written a very interesting, economics based on that, social and environmental and fairness economics based on that. I just think we need a whole new paradigm, and we need it now, and we need women to lead it, because I think at the most women basically do feel that the world is very unfair, unjust, and not the way it should be. We haven't been in control to the extent that men have. Let's try and somehow come out of this with more of a sense of listening to women's leadership at all levels, including very local, indigenous, grassroots, young levels, and try to have a different perspective entirely and challenge the status quo, challenge it all the way, and challenge it in particular because of this frightening and awful war in Ukraine and the shadow of a nuclear war with Putin putting his forces on nuclear alert. It's even more serious. So I feel, as chair of the elders, even more responsibility to try to give a leadership that really puts us in a different direction.
Excellent. That was so powerful, Mary. Thank you for everything that you shared. And to build off of that, I have very little hope that we're on the right path right now to build equitable solutions post-pandemic. And I'm coming from the United States, one of the most developed countries, quote unquote, in the world, where we've seen the inequality just grow exponentially. I already mentioned before that as a result of lockdowns and social distancing measures and the reduction of social nets, we've already witnessed and seen an increase in violence against women and children. I think that's a point that can't be emphasized enough. Here in the United States, we deal with the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. I live in the town that has some of the highest cases in the country of missing and trafficked and murdered Indigenous women. And this is something that continues to go on unabated despite, task force being created and like these symbolic efforts by government to bring more awareness and attention to this, when it's not also met with a commitment of financing and resourcing the actual solutions that are needed. Those commitments and those promises fall short. And there we see the parallels with what's going on with climate response and needing to invest in real climate solutions. I don't even think we've begun to really uncover how much inequality has increased as a result of the pandemic. I don't think we've really gotten the data to really understand that, because like the need for disaggregated data to understand the impacts on women and children is so important, and yet it is so undervalued and under prioritized by governments at all levels. And we need it both in developed and so-called developing countries, because I think we'll find that our situation is not much different when you break it down to the impacts to our local communities. I agree with Mary, like I'm an Indigenous rights advocate. I've grown up in these battles. I've witnessed it every day. Indigenous peoples don't have the luxury to focus on climate, or to focus on social equality issues, or to focus on civil rights issues, or to focus on sustainable economic development as like issue specific things. They are all interconnected. And if we don't have complex solutions to our complex problems, we are wasting our time. And we don't have time to waste anymore. You know, I grew up with the climate conscious of children in the 90s, where we were learning about, global warming and the holes in the ozone, and like just how terrifying that was. And I would have never thought that it would become increasingly terrifying as I've gotten older and have become an adult woman with children myself. And to look at where we are at now is unacceptable. We have to do more. We have to make a stronger commitment at every level of government to hold every country accountable to the solutions that are needed, and to properly resource and finance those solutions by giving the money directly to Indigenous-led organizations, women-led organizations, and entities. Because right now, what we're seeing, even with the influx of funding in post-pandemic infrastructure development, it is still going through mechanisms and processes that maintain the status quo, and that continue to keep the power, the privilege of access in the hands that it's always been in. And that is unacceptable. We have a lot of work to do, but I agree with my sister Nasreen. Like we're going to be doing it. Like these are commitments that we're going to be made, or that we're making right now, but we're going to be acting out and living in every day.
And maybe if I can jump in here with just a few positives out of COVID, believe it or not, even though it has been devastating and exacerbating the inequality, and particularly affecting women and girls, as you've rightly said. But actually, it taught us a few lessons that I just want to mention briefly. It taught us that collective human behavior can make a difference, because it was the collective behavior of wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands, etc., things we weren't doing before, and people started doing it all over the world. So we need, especially in the richer world, better habits of reducing consumption, of changing our diets, of changing our ways of transport, all the things that can be done individual, but adding up then to communities, to collective action. Secondly, government matters. That's actually important in our world. We see the far worse record of bad government. Thirdly, very, very important, science matters. We saw that health experts were beside their government advisors, and everybody was listening to them to know whether they could phase out or had to reintroduce more severe restrictions, etc. And it's still happening, but they're listening. Everybody needs to be listening to the climate scientists now, and their reports. And the last thing, and it's a strange thing, but I think there is more empathy. I think because everybody was out of their comfort zone, there was you saw in countries, including the United States, support for those who were worse off, it didn't translate into vaccine equity, to my sorrow. That was a really bad and really unforgivable. The lack of realization, even from a sensible point of view, if everybody is not vaccinated, we're not going to deal with this. And you're right that there will be another vaccine. I think it was Nisreen who said that, and she's right. And the elders have been warning about that, because we have the expertise with Gru Brundtland and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and others. And we know that we have invaded species so much, and we have these wet markets, and it's very likely that there will be another pandemic. And that's the thing. But I just wanted to bring a little hope, because the elders are charged with making sure that we are prisoners of hope, even in difficult circumstances, because hope brings energy to make a difference. And we all want to make a difference. And all on this panel, each of us. So just so we don't get too depressed about how bad things are, because they are bad. I want to inject a bit of hope.
Actually, losing hope is a privilege that we don't have.
Exactly.
Even being desperate is a privilege that we don't have.
Women are resilient. As always, women will survive. So, moving forward, Ms. Jenny, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Worship of Argentina, former Chief Staff of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and luckily member and co-founder of Global Women Leader Voices. We have a lot of questions for you. So moving forward, as indigenous women have a central role in climate mitigation and adoption, there are hundreds of good climate practices led by the indigenous women worldwide. Has your contribution been sufficiently valued and acknowledged in climate solution and climate finance? What would be your ask as an indigenous woman leader and climate advocate to the leaders of work?
My initial response is like, absolutely not. But I don't want to erase, the generations of movement building that have gotten us to the point where indigenous peoples, our rights and our knowledge systems are recognized and upheld in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, but also in other international negotiations and spaces. However, like Mary brought up before, with what our Amazon sisters were facing at the last COP and what indigenous women have been facing in almost all of these negotiation spaces, there are still several barriers to access, these important conversations and to be at the decision-making table when it comes to indigenous voices, but the voices of indigenous women and youth in particular. And not just, and when I say indigenous women, I say that broadly. I mean indigenous women and femme identifying relatives. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because so much of our negotiation spaces are also, dependent on the binary of genders, whereas indigenous peoples around the world have a more expansive idea and understanding of gender and sexuality that is not reflected in these spaces or in the types of solutions that are needed. And I think that, when we're talking about how much money globally goes to women-led organizations, it's an even smaller fraction of that when we talk about money that goes to indigenous-led initiatives and solutions. And at a time when indigenous peoples have been shown to, despite not having the land rights or the territorial rights, to still maintain stewardship of 80% of the world's remaining biological diversity. Like, this is something that needs to be addressed immediately and effectively by increasing direct access to indigenous-led organizations to climate financing mechanisms. And we're not even having that conversation right now. I know that we're also negotiating in spaces about loss and damage, and we're losing battlegrounds there as well. The safeguards need to be maintained across all of the negotiation spaces to center human rights, to also center indigenous people's rights, because that was a hard fought battle. Like indigenous people's rights, the reason why we call ourselves indigenous peoples and not communities is because we needed to be able to do that in order to gain the legal recognition of having the right to self-determination. And that right to self-determination is essential to our solutions, because our worldviews, our sciences, we also have science, right? Our sciences, our language, our practices are all core to our success in continuing to protect and preserve the world's remaining biological diversity, but it's also core to the solutions that are necessary to restore natural foodscapes, natural food systems, to protect waterways and riverways, to protect sustainable relationships with our ocean fronts and our coastal areas, with our forests. These aren't things that are, this isn't, some romanticization of who we are and what we do as indigenous peoples. This is part of the very fabric of our reality and the very core of our values that recognizes that we cannot approach these issues in a human-centric way. We must restore a sacred relationship and responsibility to all sacred life around us. We have taken so much from our Mother Earth. We have taken so much from our skies, from our waters, from our soils. That to live sustainably means that right now we need to shift our understanding of what that means, and we need to give back more than what we're taking, and we also need to be more responsible and conscious of what it is we are taking and why we are taking it. We can't just be producing energy to produce energy. We can't just be pursuing development for GDP or for these manufactured reasons that to us connote wealth, but they don't mean well-being. We have to center what our communities actually need. And for me, whenever I hear people and the solutions that they're championing, the things that they're doing, from creating sustainable micro hydropower to off-grid decentralized solar power solutions, to reducing our consumption, to reducing our waste, to looking at everything we do from cradle to grave to ensure that we are mitigating and reducing harm every step of the way in the production of things. When you get down to the solutions, you can feel and see such love. And then that's not measured in wealth. That's not measured in GDP or in dollars. And that's the type of those are the types of shifts in understanding that we need our world leaders to begin to cultivate and to adapt for themselves when we're in these decision-making processes. And if they can't, then they need to get out of the way so that the people who do can lead those discussions and can set the tone for those decisions that need to be made in that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much, Ms. Jenny, for your helpful comments. Ms. Nasreen, as a chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group, it's undeniable that young climate leaders, activists, and change makers have transformed the climate debate by speaking to power and calling on government to act and deliver on climate commitments. Most youth climate leaders happen to be young women like you. What role should youth climate advocates, professionals, and leaders play as we strive for a low carbon future, especially from where you stand today in the private sector?
I think the huge role that they can play is to step away. I'm joking. Well, actually, climate change is one of the very complex problems that we cannot actually solve it if we did not all work together. This inclusive approach to an holistic, multi-layer, innovative solution to climate change are the only way we can actually succeed. Young people are talented with different things. Some of them like to contribute to the cause by art, for example. Some of them like to do green business, because we all know that economical growth, not the growth that is now centralized, but at least someone to be able to buy their necessary needs every day and have a job is very important. And that's why green job and green entrepreneurship is a huge thing. I think we have now advocated for many years for women and girls in science, in STEAM, science, technology, mathematics, and it's very important to empower these young scientists and the young female scientists specifically. I mentioned earlier that I'm a physicist, and I can tell you how hard it is to actually continue in the field if you don't have a sustainable support from the community around you, from the university you work with, from the international community, and also just enough food in your mouth. Mary spoke about the pandemic and how now science matters. Well, I hope it's a continuous impact and it's not something that will faint away by fainting the pandemic itself. How much we are investing in science and in scientists really matters, and this is something is really lacking for many years and years now. So I think teaming up together. If you know about politics, teach me about politics, because unfortunately politicians run the world right now. It doesn't matter how much they know. if you know how to do green business, I know hundreds of young people who wants to start a green business. They don't know how to start or where to start from. If you know how to do a graphic design, for example, take a young artist and maybe try to work together on a piece. There is hundreds of ways of how can we come collectively together and work to actually save this universe, not only planet, because for me, it's the whole universe is equilibrium situation. And if one of the elements of this equilibrium fall, which is the planet, then the whole equilibrium of the universe will also fall. The question is when and who's going to decide. But because I know I can talk until after tomorrow, actually, on different ways, all of us can come together and work for climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Nasreen, for your enlightening speech. Feminist Climate Justice, a way forward after COP26 and the Generation Equality Forum. Ms. Mary Robinson, you have been an advocate for intergenerational climate justice for a long time, personally and from the elders. What's the importance and value of an intergenerational approach to climate action?
Thank you for the question, Sunita, but I'm a little bit worried about how long this is going on. I thought this was an hour. How long are we supposed to be going?
So we after that, we are having just one question from the panelists, and we are coming to an end.
Okay. Well, it's true that I have been involved in talking about climate justice for quite a long time. Actually, when I started, it was because I was working in African countries and saw the injustices of climate change, that the shocks of climate were disproportionately affecting the African countries that I was working in on their the rights that matter if you don't have them, rights to food and water, health, education, etc. And I was also honorary president of Oxfam, and they were wheeling me out as well. We weren't talking about that in Ireland. It wasn't affecting us, wasn't affecting Europe, wasn't affecting the United States. The injustice of affecting the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples, much earlier and disproportionately, although they were not responsible for what was causing it, the greenhouse gas emissions. That was the first injustice. And then within that, the gender dimension, that women have different social roles, different power, different access to rights, still having to be resilient to put food on the table, etc. Thirdly, the intergenerational injustice, and this is the one you've asked me about. Fourthly, the injustice of the different pathways to development of different regions. Because industrialized countries, we built our economies on fossil fuel, and now we have to wean ourselves off as quickly as possible. But developing countries also want to go green, and they're not getting the investment up front. They're not getting the transfer of technology, etc., that would be needed. And the fourth injustice, the injustice to nature, to Mother Nature, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species. I concentrated quite a bit in my foundation, which has wound up in 2019, because we felt we had made ourselves a little bit redundant, because a lot of people now were talking about climate justice. We focused a lot on the need to listen to the voices of young people. And then actually that was taken over by the wave of Fridays for Future, the extraordinary way in which young people with truth to power, with no compromise, have been holding us accountable, and rightly. And I find that so empowering myself, and I work very closely. And if you look at the website of the elders, theelders.org, you'll see blogs by young climate activists, intergenerational dialogue. We're at it all the time, because we're learning so much ourselves, because young people are very connected with a digital world that the elders don't necessarily fully understand. We're learning, but we're not necessarily very good at it, all the social media, etc. But young climate activists are very powerful in being able to, have movements that garnish, that bring together so many people. And we need to join up together if we're going to make progress.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Mary. So as we have limited time, I will moving forward to ask the question of our participants. We have a number of questions which have been covered during our session, but moving forward, I will ask the question of one of our panelists. That's it. The call for action made by our panelists is essential. War in Ukraine seems to capture all the attention of leaders in decision making. How do we ensure that other protected conflicts are not forgotten? And for the subject of this panel, the climate crisis retain increase the focus. So, any of our panelists who are willing to answer this question are most welcome.
I think one tip will be actually linking what's happening in Ukraine with everything else. Like I mentioned, the war in Ukraine is actually fueled by the money that goes from the continent, the European continent itself, to Russia to buy oil, LNG, and wheat also. A second very huge connection is why are we talking right now about a war where we are having drastic changes in our environment? And it simply is because these environmental changes, this climate change and climate crisis are making the world even more difficult. Economically, adaptation-wise, I think everything is very much interlinked together. And by finding the right connections to the Ukraine problem and crisis, I think we can also put our messages there. It's very important to highlight that the Ukrainian people don't deserve this. No people, no nation in the world deserves to live in a war. And talking about how much Ukraine is taking attention is not lowering the problem or underestimating it. It's a huge problem, of course. It's just if we are talking about climate justice and the concept of justice itself and the equity, and also if we want to be realistic, then everything is happening in parallel. So we don't want people and the world to forget about Ukraine. It is a problem that needs to be solved, but also it's a problem that doesn't stand alone. It's very much linked to everything else. And finding these linkages and highlighting these linkages is very important to keep the world aware of what's happening around us.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Nasreen. Could you give us an example of any public policy, either local or national policies, that has impacted you the most related to the climate change?
I can give an example, in the climate context of what made a difference, but it wasn't public policy. It was actually a realization by a number of us at the conference on climate in Copenhagen that the whole discussion was very technical and scientific and actually male dominated. Nothing about gender, nothing about human rights, nothing about people basically. And so the following year in Cancun, a number of us with Patricia Espinosa as the foreign minister at the time, we formed a network of women leaders on gender and climate. And I actually saw over the years after that, at each COP, that we were making a difference. First of all, we got a decision on parity, meaning in the delegations and in the committees of COP, etc., that there would be hopefully 50-50. Now, we haven't quite got that, but as a result of the decision, the Secretariat has to keep stock of how that is improving or not. The balance in delegations, balance in committees, balance, etc., in the COP itself. That was the first step. Then we worked with a wide constituency that had been trying to work for a gender action plan. But because these were ministers in our network, they were more powerful. They were ministers of energy, minister of environment, sometimes ministers of foreign affairs, and the heads of agencies. Amina Mohammed was a member, first of all, when she was Minister of Environment of Nigeria, and then when she was Deputy Secretary General, and Helen Clark when she was head of UNDP, and so on, from Zilli, head of UN Women, of course, and so on. But the most important, I think, step that made actually the biggest difference was when, in our discussions, we said, look, you know, you're heads of your delegations, you're the ministers, you decide who's in the delegation, who'll have the delegate badge. And when they started giving badges to young women, to indigenous women, to grassroots women, and those voices were heard at the very table. And I mean, I remember Constance O'Kellett, whom I've written about in my book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future. She's the first story in the book. She spoke about her village in Uganda that was destroyed by deep flooding in 2007. And the way she spoke about it, you could see the delegates put down their pens and listened, because they are technocrats and they argue about words and phrases and, you know, commas and, you know, how language, etc. And they don't feel the emotional urgency of climate the way that these frontline workers did, voices did. And that really made a difference over each of the COPs since then. And they're now joined by the young voices that I was talking about earlier, which are making a huge difference at conferences on climate.
Thank you so much, Ms. Marie. We are almost on the end of this session. On behalf of Global Women Leader Voices, I would like to express my gratitude to all esteemed delegates and for answering the questions, for your outstanding contribution to our discussion. I extend my gratitude to our audience, to our participants for their valuable comments and questions. By watching the video on the 3rd anniversary of Global Women Leader Voices, we are closing our session. Once again, thank you so very much from all of you for your great contribution.
And thank you, Sunita, for being a great moderator, and all the best in your hopes for Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.